Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. That's better. Thank you, Brother Paul and Sister Camille. It's great to be here. Look around this room. Look what we have here. Look at the diversity and geography and occupation, race, creed, everything. We come together and build a strong movement. And my task today is to try to talk about where our movement is at. And I want to take kind of a long view. I want to try to put the events of the last few years and also of the last few extraordinary months into some kind of long-term perspective. Not yet on the lights. We're not ready for darkness yet. We're still trying to keep things in the light. We have learned a lot since 2008. Seriously, can we get the lights back up for about 5 minutes? Thanks. Because I can't read what I'm reading here. We have learned a lot since 2008. Maybe we've relearned some things that we should have known. We learned that just electing a new president, no small feat, even one as charismatic and as brilliant and as inspiring as Obama, does not automatically change the prevailing political winds. We learned that a presidential campaign may feel like a movement. It may fill people with the hope and energy and camaraderie of a movement, but it is not actually a movement. Movements have their own values, their own goals, and their own aspirations, and their own leadership, and they are autonomous of any political leader. We learned, no, I think we definitely relearned this, that no American president, not Roosevelt or Lincoln or LBJ in his best years, and he had a few of them, and certainly not Obama, brings about progressive change from the top. Presidents need movements like ours to make them great, whether it was the abolition movement, or the labor movement, or the civil rights movement. And on this one, we need to take a hard look at ourselves in the mirror. We've learned since 2008 that the toxic ideology of limited government, low taxes, deregulation, and the destruction of unions is deeply, deeply embedded in the American political psyche, aided and abetted by a right-wing network of organizations and think tanks that's funded by an apparently endless flow of corporate money. And we learned that a relatively small group of misguided right-wing activists, with, give it to them, real grassroots energy and a willingness to confront our side with confrontational tactics and unequivocal demands, can change the course of politics in dramatic ways. And of course it helps to have the Koch brothers and Fox News on your side. And on the flip side, we learned that if our leaders do not articulate a clear set of alternative politics, rooted in a clear set of alternative values, we certainly can't beat something with nothing. And the bitter fruits of that approach we see again in last night's budget deal. And finally, we learned that even when the other side's political economy completely implodes, causing unimaginable human hardship around the globe, they don't retreat. They don't apologize. They don't compromise. They demand even more of that which caused the implosion in the first place. In its own way, it's pretty impressive. And finally, here in New York, we learned over the last 2 years that when progressives achieve a measure of power, when they manage to raise the minimum wage, raise taxes on the richest people in the state, when they take on a billionaire mayor over term limits and raise the possibility of strengthened rent regulations, the corporate elite and its media allies hit back with formidable power. They try to take you down. They play for keeps, and it's nothing to sneeze at. Now, if we'd been meeting in November or December, I'm not sure what else I would have been able to say. The 2010 elections were certainly as bleak and painful a reversal as we could imagine. We might have talked about the long arc of history bending toward justice, about how at some point things would change because they have to. But in truth, we would have been summing up hope because that's our job. And I'm not sure how effectively we would have been able to convince ourselves. But then, almost like magic, when you least expect it, Wisconsin happens. And it seems like everything changes, or at least things that seemed unimaginable 3 months ago all of a sudden seemed possible. And the rhetoric about the long arc seems vividly, tangibly, powerfully real. How did we get to this moment? What is possible? What are the tasks of our movement? I want to spend the next few minutes trying to review how we got here from the point of view of changes in politics and economics over the last 40 years. Don't worry, I won't talk about every single year. But I think for us to be effective, it's critical to try to understand how we got to this juncture and what that suggests about how we can move forward. So I want to go back to the 70s, a highly underrated decade, and remind everyone that the economic crisis of American corporate capitalism struck with great force in the mid-70s. 2 giant recessions in 75, 79, 82. Next slide. And what is really amazing, if you go back and look at this period, is that the elite, the employers, actually began to talk about the possibility of the collapse of the free enterprise system in the United States. They were worried about campus radicalism. Ralph Nader scared the living daylights out of them. Our side passed things like clean air and clean water and OSHA. They thought the media was hostile. And some of you may have read about this, but there was a guy named Lewis Powell, He ended up becoming a Supreme Court justice for like 30, 40 years. And 3 months before he's nominated by Nixon to be on the court, he's commissioned by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to write a memo, which has now become somewhat celebrated. How many of you have heard about the Powell memo? A few, okay. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says, the free enterprise system is going down, what do we do? And he writes, I'm not going to read all this stuff, but he writes in the first bullet, no thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack. The overriding first need is for businessmen to recognize that the ultimate issue may be survival. Survival of what we call the free enterprise system, and all this means for the strength and prosperity of America and the freedom of our people. He talks in the next bullet about how business has responded at all levels by appeasement, ineptitude, and ignoring the problem. And then he talks about how strength lies in organization and careful long-range planning and implementation and so on and so forth. Next slide. And so he outlines a plan. We've got to infiltrate the campuses, we've got to set up think tanks, we've got to completely change our approach in a more comprehensive way. In the early 70s, right around the same time, the top CEOs in the United States formed something called the Business Roundtable, because they feel that they are being unheard. Remember, this is hard to imagine, right? Unheard in the halls of Congress. Justin Dart, who was one of the leaders of one of the right-wing companies, Dart Industries, famously says, not so famously, famous now, at a political action conference of the Chamber of Commerce and a bunch of other groups in '78, a company that doesn't have a PAC is either apathetic, unintelligent, or you've got a death wish. And the number of corporate PACs rise from 89 in 1974 to 821 in 1978. The Chamber of Commerce gets an activist president named Richard Lesher, who says, I believe that if any organization had the potential to turn the country away from its drift towards socialism, this was the institution. Kind of hard to imagine this situation. And of course, it's really nothing new. Next. This is Alfred Sloan, the CEO of GM. Hit the next button. Took 14 years to rid this country of prohibition. It's going to take a good long while to rid the country of the New Deal, but sooner or later the axe falls and we get a change. This is 1945. Next. So what's their program? Their program has a lot of different names. Trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, neoliberalism. It consists of certain fundamental elements. First, massive deregulation. Airlines in '78, trucking in '80, telecom in '84 and '96, and so on and so forth, and especially finance repeatedly between '78 and 2000. Next. The second critical element is slashing tax rates on the wealthy. You can see here, this is the 50s and the 60s. Under that communist menace, Dwight and David Eisenhower, the top marginal tax rate on the rich was 90%. Under Nixon, it was about 70%, and then when Reagan comes in, he cuts it virtually in half. And so you can see the gigantic drop in tax cuts on the rich, and tax rates on the rich. Go ahead. And of course, there's an attack on the labor movement. We were already starting to go down. We reached our peak in the mid-50s at 36% in the private sector. By this point, we're at 23 or 24%, and you can see the precipitous drop. Next. There are changes going on in the economy. Industry steadily declines. So finance, insurance, and real estate begin to dominate the economy. Stock market capitalization of these sectors goes from $500 billion in '94 to over $3.5 trillion in 2007. Financial services profits were once 10% of the total of U.S. profits. By the mid-2000s, they're over 40% of the total economic profits of the society. Next. And of course, there's far-reaching deregulation in the financial sector, which leads to increasingly reckless speculation and complex investments. I won't go through all that. That's our friend Phil Graham. Go ahead. So what's the result? This shows the share of total income going to the top 10%. And I don't know if you can see the dates, but basically from the 30s onward, it drops, so that the share going to the top 10% is in the mid-30s. It stays that way till the mid-70s, and then the top 10% begins to get an increasing share of the wealth in the society. Next. You've all heard this, I think, that the level of the amount of income going to the top 1% in our society is now the same as it was in 1928, about 23.5 or 24%. We are back to pre-depression levels of income disparity. Next. This is my favorite chart because it's so vivid. The orange bars show growth in income from 47 to 73. And it's divided up on the bottom by 5 quintiles, and then the top 10th of a percent and the top 100th of a percent. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, the orange bars from 47 to 73 are actually going up higher. The poorest people and the lower income people and the middle income people, their incomes are actually rising faster from 47 to 73 than the wealthiest. But from 73 on, the poorest 20% go up 3%, the fourth 20% go up 38%, the richest go up 64%, but at the very top, the people making 1.3 million a year, the top 1/10 of a percent, they go up 353%. And the top 100th of 1%, those making 5.9 million a year, their income from 73 to 2005 grows by 513%. Next. And so what we see happening is that while productivity, the top line is productivity, the actual output per worker actually continues to rise, wages stagnate. And all that money in between, all that output, is going to the wealthiest people in our society. Next. So wages are stagnating. What do workers do? They start to take on debt. Overall household debt grows from $705 billion at the end of 1974 to $14.5 trillion by the middle of 2008. I didn't realize this until I started looking at this, but there was no such thing as a home equity loan in the 70s. People didn't have them. There was $1 billion in home equity loans in 1982. By 2008, there was $1 trillion in home equity loans. And in 2008, the typical USA household owned 13 credit cards with 40% of households carrying a balance. Next. All that money, all that debt that's floating out there now is going increasingly into subprime loans and risky investments in mortgage-backed securities. $35 billion in subprime mortgages in '94, $600 billion in 2006. And on the other hand, people are starting to invest in houses. 22% of homes in 2006 were purchased for investment purposes, 14% for vacation homes. Mortgage-backed securities tripled between '96 and 2007 to $7.3 trillion, and the amount of credit default swaps goes up to $45 trillion. Next. So this was great when housing prices were going up. But then when the bubble burst, there was devastation from Wall Street. Next. to Main Street. By the end of 2008, nearly 2 million homeowners had lost their homes. 5 million homes are delinquent in foreclosure. Housing prices have fallen 30%. Homeowners lost $6 trillion in housing values since 2006. Next, skip this. Of course, Wall Street is still raking it in, right? The bonuses, they dipped a little bit in 2008, but they're back to $20.3 billion in 2009. Next. The rest of us live in Walmart America, a second Gilded Age. Next. 68% of workers in large and medium firms have no defined benefit pension plan. 57% of workers in the private sector have no retirement account at all. Not a 401k, not a defined pension, nothing. And the median amount in a 401k is $45,000, which, if you're retiring, is probably good for like a year and a half. And we know about 50 million people have no health insurance. We know that 14.3% of people are living in poverty. Next. Unemployment has come down a little bit since this slide, still very high. Long-term, next. Record levels, you all know this, of long-term unemployment. Never before have we seen since in the post-war era a higher percentage of people unemployed for more than half a year at a time. Next. And finally, this explains how we get to the current moment, the ruling elite has figured out there's one place in the economy, one place in the working class where people still have power, and that's the public sector, right? And so that explains why the guns have now been focused on public sector unionists all across the country. So let's bring the lights back up. So in light of all this, it's a little easier to understand, I think, why simply electing Obama was not enough to inaugurate a new era of social and economic progressivism. Set aside for the moment that he has surrounded himself with mainstream economists, many of whom were the architects of the neoliberal consensus that led to the crash in the first place. Set aside that it seems like his highest principle is compromise. In the absence of truly powerful pressure from below, changing the course of this attack is hard to imagine. This history makes clear that we are facing a long-term, concerted, multifaceted, well-funded campaign to restore the power of the corporate elite, to continue imposing greater and greater austerity on the working and middle classes. It will take more than a president to reverse this trajectory. This history also makes clear why Paul Ryan's budget proposal to privatize Medicare, to slash taxes for the wealthy, to slash the rolls of Medicaid by millions should come as no surprise. It's an extension of this, it's an extension of Bush's attempt to roll back Social Security in 2005. But the last 3 months also teaches us something entirely different. It teaches us that history can literally move at the speed of light, that spectacular movement is possible even when you least expect it. Anybody in this room could have predicted in December that all through January and February it would be front page news, it would be the lead story on the evening news that there's a fight in America over the rights of public workers to bargain collectively. No one could have predicted that. Take it one step further. Could anybody have predicted in December that there would literally be peaceful revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and unrest would be sweeping across North Africa and the Middle East? And I believe there's a relationship between those two things. I believe that what happened in Madison probably would not have happened with the things that happened in Tahrir Square.
That's in Egypt.
Yes. That's in Egypt. Here's what else we've learned from Wisconsin. Americans will draw the line when their rights are attacked. Workers in Wisconsin and elsewhere are willing to make financial sacrifices, up to a point. But when you assault their fundamental democratic rights, they push back. Here's another thing we learned from Wisconsin. Young people were key to the struggle. One of the key turning points came when the graduate teaching assistants decided there was going to be a hearing about the collective bargaining rollback legislation. They had 1,000 people. They decided all of them were going to testify. And that turned into the occupation that led to what we saw happening over the weeks that happened later. So young people were key. They were on the cutting edge. And it needs to be young people like those sitting in the room, not those with fading heads of hair that are gray, who are going to play a lot of leadership role in this movement. There's more. Beneath that spectacular mobilization in defense of the fundamental rights of working people, I believe there is a powerful undercurrent that is saying at long last, enough is enough. Workers and community activists and students and just plain ordinary people are saying, it is just too much. It is too much that we're losing our jobs, our houses, our health care, and our pension security. That our children's hopes for a better life are being mortgaged to greedy bankers and college loan lenders, while Wall Street bonuses soar, while bank profits soar, while the endless orgy of tax cuts for the wealthiest, for those who brought on the crisis in the first place, goes on and on. It is simply too much that the 400 wealthiest people in this country have as much wealth as the unluckiest 150 million. It is too much to say that the banks are too big to fail, to see trillions lavished on them in bailouts, but then to say the victims of foreclosure are too small to bail because they just don't count or their campaign contributions aren't big enough. Millions of Americans are finally saying it's too much, enough is enough, and it needs to stop now. Doug Fraser, if you go back to the 1970s, Doug Fraser, who was then the president of the UAW, sat on a committee. It was actually a subcommittee of the Business Roundtable. It was a labor management subcommittee. And when the Business Roundtable mobilized against the very tepid labor law reform program that was being pushed under the Carter administration, mobilized hugely, Fraser resigned. And he said, he wrote a letter to the Business Roundtable, he said, I can't in good conscience be part of this anymore because you are waging a one-sided class war. I say it's long past time for a one-sided class war. Now it's time for the other side, our side, to go into action. So what do we in the Working Families Party and all of our allies in labor and community and progressive movements do? What is our unique role? What we have built here is an organization which organizes around issues day in and day out, 365 days a year, puts an agenda on the table, and also has the electoral power to take action against those who oppose us and to support those who support us. We need to try to reach out across the country and to build a network of organizations that will take a similar approach, that have the power to push an agenda and to engage in retribution against those who oppose that agenda at the same time. And this spring and this summer, all across the country, we need to draw the line against the Paul Ryan budget and the ultimate effort to smash the remaining achievements of the New Deal. We need to stand up for decency and humanity in our society and sit down in the offices of Nan Hayworth and Richard Hanna and Michael Grimm and Anne-Marie Berkel. If they support the Ryan budget, or in the office of any Democrat who's thinking of making a compromise on these fundamental principles and components of a fair and decent economy. We need to take the spirit of Madison into the office of any congressperson who stands in our way. On May 12th in New York City, we need to join the giant mobilization against Chase Bank and say enough is enough. It's time to put an end to Wall Street greed. It's time to stop ripping off New York City. It's time to start modifying loans and help solve the housing crisis. It's time for bankers to share the sacrifice. And on May 16th and 17th, we need to take that energy to Columbus, Ohio, where Chase Bank is having its annual shareholders meeting, and have tens of thousands send the same message there in the heartland. We need to fight to protect rent laws. We need to raise the minimum wage in Albany. We need to fight for paid sick days and living wages in New York City. We need to hold Bloomberg accountable for his cynical attempt to pit teachers against parents and to use a totally unjustified threat of layoffs to gut teachers' rights and jam an anti-middle class budget through the city council. More than anything else, More than anything else, we need to seize this moment. I don't want to overclaim. I don't want to be glib. There's nothing is guaranteed. But I think we can all feel that something is going on. We saw it in the literally hundreds of solidarity actions that sprung up around the country in a matter of days in support of Madison. We saw it in the hundreds of actions that took place last Monday on April 4th across the country on the 43rd anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. New things are possible. We need to make the most of them. We may not succeed, not right away, but we have no choice. We have no choice. We must fight, and we will. The stakes of the fight can't be overstated. I want to close by reading an email message that actually was sent to Danny from an old friend of his who lives in Madison and was participating in the sit-ins in Madison. This was like February 23rd and 24th, the day that we were going to have the first round of nationwide demonstrations in support of the workers in Wisconsin. And she wrote, "Danny, is there any chance you were speaking at the New York City Solidarity Rally at City Hall on Saturday? We could really use some powerful support. We are exhilarated and exhausted here. Right now I'm in an exhausted moment and sick to death of being cold and standing outside on the hard, icy pavement. If you're speaking, I have a little tidbit to offer you. It comes from an Egyptian friend of my daughter, Maddie, in Cairo, a young man who was out on Tahrir Square every day. He has my daughters in Egypt now. If you want to use it, please do. If someone gave me the podium and a megaphone, I'd read them this. Friend's name is Hatham. I was just told by Maddie about the situation where you live. And I want to let you know that the Egyptian revolution supports rightness everywhere in the world. And as we face corruption, you too must do till the end of the whole world. In God's speed, and may the spirits of the Shohada who fell for freedom here be with you." Susan concludes, "I don't know. It makes me feel like it all matters a lot, and it helps me keep going. Some days are longer than others, aren't they? Saturday is going to be a big day here for sure. The stakes are high, but we are up to the challenge." Thank you, brothers and sisters.